Welcome to Marple Whispers. I'm Sean, your guide through shadows and secrets. Here, every teacup trembles with hidden truths, and every smile may mask a crime. Settle in. The mystery is about to unfold. In the misty shadows of Paris, where rain hides deadly secrets, elderly sleuth Miss Jane Marple receives a chilling letter from her old friend, widow Eleanor Hargreaves. "I'm being watched! Come quickly!" Rushing to a grand apartment by the Seine, Marple arrives just in time to witness Eleanor's shocking collapse over a glass of wine, dismissed as heart failure, but reeking of cyanide poison. As the storm rages, Marple uncovers a web of greed and betrayal. A scheming art dealer pressuring Eleanor to sell her valuable paintings, a jealous neighbour slipping anonymous threats and tainted gifts, and a scarred thug lurking in dark alleys. With her knitting needles as her only weapon, Marple gathers the suspects in a tense showdown, exposing the killer's envious heart and forged will. Will justice prevail in the City of Light, or will the rain wash away the truth forever? Dive into this Agatha Christie-inspired mystery, where one spinster's sharp eyes unravel murder most foul. Chapter 1. The Letter from Paris. The afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's parlour in the serene village of Chipping Cleghorn, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak table where her knitting lay abandoned for a moment. She sat in her favourite armchair, a soft shawl draped over her shoulders, her keen blue eyes fixed on the vibrant roses swaying gently in the garden breeze. At her age, one appreciated the simple rhythms of village life, the predictable comings and goings of neighbours, the distant chime of the church bell marking the hours. Yet, Miss Marple knew better than most that beneath such tranquillity often lurked the unexpected, the shadowy undercurrents of human nature that could twist even the most ordinary day into something far more sinister. It was on this unassuming afternoon that the postman, Mr. Jenkins, cycled up the gravel path, his satchel bulging with the day's deliveries. He handed her a single envelope with a cheerful nod, commenting on the fine weather before pedalling away. Miss Marple examined the letter with a mild curiosity. The stamp bore the elegant profile of the French Republic, and the postmark read Paris. The handwriting on the address was familiar, elegant looping script that belonged to her old acquaintance, Mrs. Eleanor Hargreaves. Eleanor had been a school friend from long ago, though their paths had diverged sharply since those youthful days. While Miss Marple had remained rooted in the English countryside, content with her observations of village intrigues, Eleanor had married a prominent diplomat, Sir Reginald Hargreaves, and embarked on a life of international glamour. Now widowed for over a year, she had chosen to settle in Paris, drawn perhaps by the city's allure of art and sophistication. Their correspondence had been sporadic but warm, filled with reminiscences and light gossip. This letter, however, felt different even before she opened it. The paper was of fine quality, yet slightly creased, as if handled with haste. Slipping on her spectacles, Miss Marple carefully slit the envelope with a silver letter opener and unfolded the single sheet inside. The words were few, penned in Eleanor's distinctive hand, but they carried an undercurrent of urgency that made Miss Marple's fingers tighten on the page. "Dear Jane," it began, "I hope this finds you well in your peaceful corner of the world. Paris is as enchanting as ever, the boulevards alive with energy, the Seine glittering under the lights. Yet I must confess to a growing unease that I cannot quite shake. Strange visitors have called, unannounced and evasive, and I have the persistent feeling of being observed, though by whom or why, I cannot say. It is foolish, perhaps, but I find myself glancing over my shoulder more often than not. If your schedule permits, do consider a visit. Your sensible company would be a balm to my nerves. Yours affectionately, Eleanor. Miss Marple set the letter down, her mind already whirring like the well-oiled gears of a detective's puzzle box. Eleanor was no alarmist. She possessed a steady temperament forged in the demanding social circles of diplomatic life. This hint of fear, veiled though it was, suggested something tangible. Perhaps a threat from her past or a new entanglement in the City of Light. Miss Marple recalled whispers from mutual friends about Eleanor's recent inheritance, a substantial sum that could attract unsavory attention. Greed, she knew from experience, was a motive as old as time, capable of poisoning even the most refined relationships. Rising from her chair with purposeful grace, she moved to the writing desk and penned a quick telegram to her nephew, Raymond West, informing him of her impending trip. Then she telephoned the local station to inquire about trains to London, followed by the ferry schedules across the Channel. Paris beckoned, not with the promise of leisure, but with the intrigue of a mystery unfolding. As she packed a small valise with essentials, a warm cardigan, her best hat, and of course her knitting, Miss Marple felt a familiar thrill. The village might be quiet, but the world beyond held secrets waiting to be unraveled, and she was more than ready to thread the needle. Chapter 2. The Rainy City. The Channel crossing had been choppy, the ferry pitching against restless waves that mirrored the gathering storm clouds overhead. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her sensible woolen coat, had spent the journey on deck, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where England faded into a misty blur. She had always found travel invigorating, a chance to observe the varied tapestry of humanity. Families huddled against the wind, businessmen clutching briefcases, lovers stealing glances amid the spray. But today, her thoughts were inward, circling the cryptic words of Eleanor's letter. What shadows lurked in Paris that could unsettle a woman as composed as her old friend? As the train from Calais pulled into Gare du Nord, the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the station's vast glass roof like impatient fingers. Paris greeted her with its customary bustle, porters shouting in rapid French, vendors hawking newspapers and flowers, the air thick with the scent of fresh bread and diesel fumes. Miss Marple hailed a taxi, her valise clutched firmly, and directed the driver to Rue de la Paix, where Eleanor's apartment overlooked the Seine. The city unfolded before her in a watercolour wash of grey, elegant houseman buildings blurred by the downpour, umbrellas blooming like black flowers on the sidewalks. The Eiffel Tower, a distant silhouette shrouded in mist. The rain intensified as they crossed the Pont Neuf, the Seine churning below in muddy swells. Miss Marple leaned back against the worn leather seat, her mind drifting to past visits to this enchanting yet enigmatic city. Paris, with its labyrinth of streets and hidden courtyards, had always reminded her of a beautifully wrapped package, one that might conceal delights or dangers. She recalled a long-ago holiday here, when a seemingly trivial theft at a cafe had unravelled into a web of deceit involving a forged will and a jealous heir. People, she mused, carried their frailties wherever they went, and no amount of continental charm could disguise the baser instincts. The taxi halted before a grand edifice of cream stone, its wrought iron balconies glistening under the relentless drizzle. Miss Marple paid the driver with crisp francs, tipping modestly as was her habit, and stepped into the building's marble-floored lobby. The concierge, a portly man with a waxed moustache named Pierre, greeted her with effusive politeness, his eyes appraising her unassuming figure. "Madame Hargreaves expects you, mademoiselle," he said, leading her to the lift. As they ascended, Miss Marple noted his immaculate uniform and the way his gaze flickered toward the upper floors, nervous perhaps. Concierges, in her experience, were fonts of information, their discretion often a mask for keen observation. Eleanor's apartment on the 3rd floor was a testament to refined taste. High ceilings adorned with intricate mouldings, walls lined with gilt-framed mirrors and shelves of leather-bound books, Persian rugs muffling footsteps on parquet floors. The drawing room overlooked the river, where barges plodded through the rain like weary beasts. Eleanor herself opened the door, her face lighting with genuine warmth that failed to fully dispel the shadows beneath her eyes. She was a vision of elegance, a tall woman in her late 50s. Her silver hair swept into a chignon, dressed in a tailored silk blouse and pearl earrings that caught the dim light. Yet there was a fragility about her, a slight tremor in her hand as she embraced Miss Marple. "Jane, how good of you to come so promptly," Eleanor said, her voice a cultured contralto with a hint of strain. "The weather is wretched, isn't it? Come, warm yourself by the fire." She led her guest to a crackling hearth, where a maid, young Sophie, with wide eyes and a starched apron, bustled in with a tray of tea and madeleines. As they settled into plush armchairs, the rain lashed against the tall windows, creating a cocoon of intimacy amid the storm. Miss Marple accepted a cup of Earl Grey, her mild eyes taking in every detail. The faint crease in Eleanor's brow, the way her fingers toyed with a lace handkerchief, the subtle disarray of papers on a nearby desk. Letters, perhaps, or bills. "You look well, Eleanor," she said gently, "though your letter suggested otherwise. Tell me what troubles you." Eleanor sighed, setting her cup down with a soft clink. "It's probably nothing, Jane. Silly fancies of a widow alone in a foreign city. But since Reginald's passing, I've felt exposed. The inheritance was generous, yes, allowing me this fresh start away from London's stifling memories. Paris seemed ideal. The art galleries, the cafes, the anonymity. Yet lately, anomalies have crept in." She paused, glancing toward the window, where rivulets distorted the view of the opposite bank. "First, the notes slipped under my door at odd hours, unsigned with cryptic warnings like, 'Beware the shadows of the past.' Then, footsteps in the hall late at night, pausing outside my apartment before retreating. And there's a man. I've seen him loitering across the street, always in a dark coat and hat pulled low as if watching." Miss Marple listened without interruption, her expression one of sympathetic interest, though her mind catalogued each revelation like clues in a village scandal. The notes suggested intimidation, the footsteps surveillance, the man a tangible threat. "Have you informed the authorities?" she asked. Eleanor shook her head. "What would I say? It's all so vague. No overt harm done. Besides, the police here are efficient but impersonal. They'd dismiss it as paranoia." Her eyes met Miss Marple's, pleading, "But you, Jane, you've always had that uncanny knack for seeing through facades. Do I have enemies? None that I know of. Reginald's diplomatic career was uneventful, no scandals, though—" She trailed off, a flicker of doubt crossing her features. "Though what, dear?" Miss Marple prompted softly, recalling how such hesitations often hid pivotal truths. "There was a distant cousin, Arthur, who contested the will briefly, claiming undue influence. It was settled amicably, but he harbours resentment. And here in Paris I've made acquaintances. Monsieur Lefebvre, an art dealer who admires my amateur paintings. Madame Dubois, a neighbour with a sharp tongue and envious eyes. Trivial, surely?" Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. Inheritance disputes, bred malice, and envy could fester into action. She glanced at the clock. Dusk was falling early under the storm clouds. "We'll unravel it together," she assured. "Now show me to my room. I shan't impose long." The guest chamber was charming, with a four-poster bed and views of the rain-swept courtyard below. As Miss Marple unpacked, she pondered Eleanor's words, drawing parallels to a case in Chipping Cleghorn, where anonymous letters had masked a deeper plot. Human nature, she reflected, was universal. Greed in a Parisian salon, no different from jealousy in an English vicarage. Dinner was a quiet affair. Coq au vin prepared by Sophie, paired with a fine Bordeaux. Conversation flowed lightly at first. Reminiscences of school days, Eleanor's recent visits to the Louvre, but tension simmered beneath. Eleanor retired early, pleading fatigue, leaving Miss Marple to knit by the fire, her needles clicking in rhythm with the rain. The building creaked in the wind, and once she fancied she heard footsteps in the corridor, halting briefly before fading. It was nearing midnight when the scream shattered the night, a piercing cry from Eleanor's bedroom, cut short abruptly. Miss Marple sprang up, her heart pounding, and hurried down the hall. The door was ajar. Inside, Eleanor lay crumpled on the Aubusson rug, her face ashen, a crystal wine glass overturned beside her, its contents pooling darkly. Sophie burst in moments later, gasping, followed by Pierre pounding up the stairs. "Mon Dieu!" the concierge exclaimed, kneeling to check for a pulse. "She's gone!" The doctor, summoned hastily, arrived within the hour, a brisk man with a goatee who examined the body amid the flickering gas lamps. "Heart failure," he pronounced, noting Eleanor's age and recent stresses. "A sudden attack, tragic but not uncommon." He signed the certificate with a flourish, offering condolences before departing into the storm. But Miss Marple, standing quietly in the shadows, observed more. The faint bitterness in the spilled wine's aroma, the unnatural rigidity of Eleanor's limbs, the half-empty decanter on the nightstand. Poison? Her instincts, honed by countless quiet inquiries, screamed foul play. As the room emptied, she bent to retrieve a stray thread from the rug. Dark wool, not from Eleanor's attire. The rain hammered on, a relentless accomplice to whatever darkness had claimed her friend. Paris, it seemed, held secrets deadlier than she had imagined, and Miss Marple vowed to expose them, one subtle clue at a time. Chapter 3. The Residence of Rue de la Paix. The morning after Eleanor's death dawned with a sullen sky. The rain reduced to a persistent drizzle that clung to the windows like a shroud. Miss Jane Marple sat in the apartment's drawing-room, her knitting untouched on her lap, her gaze fixed on the Seine, where mist curled like ghostly fingers over the water. The doctor's verdict of heart failure, delivered with such confident finality, had failed to convince her. In her experience, sudden deaths were rarely as simple as they seemed, and the bitter scent of the spilled wine lingered in her memory, a silent accusation. Inspector Dubois, a lean man with a meticulous moustache and a manner as starched as his uniform, had arrived at dawn to tie up formalities. He was courteous but dismissive, his clipboard and fountain pen signalling a case already closed. "A tragedy, mademoiselle," he said, adjusting his spectacles, "but natural. Madame Hargreaves was not young, and grief can weaken the heart." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression one of meek agreement, though her mind bristled. She had met men like Dubois before, competent yet blind to the subtleties of human malice. "Of course, Inspector," she replied softly, "but might I, as an old friend, ask a few questions of those who knew her here, for my own peace of mind?" Dubois hesitated, then shrugged, seeing no harm in an elderly Englishwoman's inquiries. "As you wish, mademoiselle, but do not trouble yourself overly. The matter is settled." With his permission, Miss Marple turned her attention to the residents of the grand building on Rue de la Paix, each a potential thread in the tapestry of Eleanor's demise. She began in the courtyard, a cobblestone square framed by ivy-clad walls and a small fountain, now silent under the drizzle. Settling on a wrought-iron bench, she opened her knitting bag, the soft click of her needles a disarming rhythm that invited confidences. She knew from Chipping Cleghorn's gossip mills that people revealed more when they thought you harmless, and her frail appearance, white hair neatly pinned, spectacles perched low, was her greatest asset. Her first encounter was with Pierre, the concierge, who bustled out to check the post-boxes, his polished shoes splashing through puddles. He was in his 40s, with a round face and a penchant for florid gestures, his cheerfulness a touch too practised. "A sad day, mademoiselle," he said, tipping his cap. "Madame Hargreaves was a fine lady, always kind to me." Miss Marple smiled, offering a compliment on his diligence. "You must see everything that happens here, Pierre," she said lightly. "Did Eleanor ever mention anyone troubling her?" Pierre's eyes flickered, a momentary shadow crossing his jovial mask. "Troubling? Non, she was well liked, though—" He leaned closer, voice lowering. "A few days ago, I saw her arguing in the lobby with a man, a stranger in a dark coat, his hat pulled low. Sharp words, though I couldn't hear them clearly. She seemed upset, told me later it was a misunderstanding." Miss Marple's needles paused. The man in the dark coat, Eleanor's letter had mentioned him. "And this man, did he return?" she asked. Pierre shook his head, but his hesitation suggested he knew more than he let on. Next, she encountered Monsieur André Lefebvre, the retired art dealer from the second floor as he descended the stairs, a Havana cigar trailing a plume of fragrant smoke. He was a man of 60, with silver hair slicked back and a silk cravat that spoke of wealth, if not taste. His manner was polished, but his eyes, narrow and calculating, reminded Miss Marple of a village shopkeeper she'd once known, who'd swindled widows with forged antiques. "A terrible loss," Lefebvre said, pausing to offer condolences. "Madame Hargreaves had an eye for beauty, you know. Her paintings were quite remarkable for an amateur." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Eleanor had mentioned her painting hobby only in passing, yet Lefebvre spoke as if familiar with her work. "Did she ever show you her canvases?" she asked, her tone innocent. Lefebvre's smile tightened. "Once or twice, at a gallery event. She was modest, but her landscapes had potential." His vagueness intrigued her. Art, she knew, could be a lucrative motive, especially with Eleanor's newfound wealth. The courtyard soon drew another resident, Madame Claire Dubois, a widow in her 30s, whose youthful beauty was marred by a petulant mouth and eyes that darted with restless curiosity. She wore a chic fur-trimmed coat, her perfume heavy with jasmine, and carried a dripping umbrella. "You must be Eleanor's friend from England," she said, her French accent crisp. "Such a shock, her passing. We were close, you know. She confided in me." Miss Marple doubted this. Eleanor's letter had hinted at unease with her neighbours. "How kind of you to befriend her," she replied, watching Claire's face. "Did she ever speak of her fears?" She wrote to me of feeling watched." Claire's lips pursed, as if weighing her response. Oh, Eleanor was fanciful at times. City life, you understand, can unsettle newcomers. She mentioned a man loitering outside, but I told her it was likely nothing. Paris is full of strangers. Her tone was dismissive, yet her fingers tightened on her umbrella, a telltale sign of unease. As Claire sauntered off, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Sophie, the maid whom she found polishing silver in the apartment's pantry. Sophie was barely 20, with nervous hands and a tendency to blush under scrutiny. "Madame was so kind," she whispered, eyes brimming, "but she was frightened these last weeks. Once, I saw her burn a note she found under the door, said it was nonsense, but her hands shook." Miss Marple pressed gently, learning that a small parcel had arrived for Eleanor the morning of her death, a plain box, no sender's name, which Sophie had placed on the hall table. When Miss Marple asked to see it, Sophie paled. "It's gone, mademoiselle. I looked this morning, but it's vanished." The missing parcel, the dark-coated stranger, the cryptic notes, each fragment fueled Miss Marple's suspicion that Eleanor's death was no accident. She recalled a case in Chipping Cleghorn, where a stolen letter had unmasked a blackmailer. Here the stakes felt higher, the threads more tangled. As she knitted, a memory surfaced. Eleanor's mention of her cousin Arthur, bitter over the inheritance, and Lefebvre's interest in her paintings. Could wealth or art be the key? And Claire's curiosity, envy perhaps of Eleanor's fortune. That afternoon, Miss Marple ventured to the lobby, where Pierre was sorting mail. "One last question," she said, her voice mild. "Did anyone visit Eleanor yesterday before I arrived?" Pierre hesitated, then admitted Madame Dubois stopped by with a bottle of wine. "A gift," she said. They spoke briefly, then she left. Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing. Wine, like the glass beside Eleanor's body, could carry poison as easily as goodwill. As she returned to the courtyard, the drizzle thickened, veiling the building in a grey haze. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, but her thoughts were far from idle. The residents of Rue de la Paix, she sensed, were players in a drama where greed, envy, or vengeance held the stage. She would watch, listen, and piece together the truth, just as she had in countless village intrigues. Paris might dazzle, but its secrets, like those of Chipping Cleghorn, would yield to her quiet persistence. Chapter 4. The Scent of Poison. The rain had settled into a mournful rhythm by the second day of Miss Jane Marple's stay in Paris, each droplet tapping against the windows of Eleanor Hargreaves's apartment, like a coded message awaiting decryption. The grand building on Rue de la Paix, with its ornate cornices and marble lobby, seemed to huddle under the grey sky, as if guarding its secrets more closely in the wake of tragedy. Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting needles idle for once, her sharp eyes scanning the space where her friend had lived. And died. Inspector Dubois, with his clipped efficiency, had reiterated his verdict of heart failure, but the faint, acrid scent Miss Marple had detected near the spilled wine glass gnawed at her. It was not the bouquet of a fine Bordeaux, but something sharper, more sinister. A whiff of almonds that whispered of cyanide. She had requested, with her characteristic diffidence, permission to examine Eleanor's apartment more thoroughly. Dubois, impatient to close the case, had granted it with a wave of his hand, muttering about sentimental Englishwomen. But Miss Marple was no mere sentimentalist. Her mild demeanour cloaked a mind as precise as a watchmaker's. She moved through the apartment with deliberate care, her sensible shoes silent on the Persian rugs, her spectacles glinting as she studied the scene. The bedroom, where Eleanor had been found, was a study in elegance. A mahogany vanity strewn with crystal perfume bottles, a velvet chaise by the window, and the nightstand where the overturned wineglass still lay, its contents long since soaked into the rug. Kneeling with a care that belied her age, Miss Marple brought her face close to the glass. The almond-like odour was faint but unmistakable, a signature of poison she had encountered once before, in a Chipping Cleghorn scandal involving a jilted suitor and a tampered cordial. She refrained from touching the glass, knowing the police had overlooked it in their haste. Instead, she noted its position, near the edge of the nightstand, as if knocked over in a moment of sudden distress. The decanter, half full, stood nearby, its stopper askew. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Poison required opportunity, and opportunity required access. Her next step was to speak with Sophie, the young maid, whom she found in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she polished a silver tray. Sophie's eyes were red-rimmed, her apron askew, and she started at Miss Marple's gentle approach. "Oh, mademoiselle, it's so dreadful," she whispered, her French soft and rapid. "Madame was so good to me. She didn't deserve this." Miss Marple offered a comforting smile, settling at the kitchen table with an air of unhurried curiosity. "You were close to her, weren't you, Sophie? Tell me, did anyone visit Madame Hargreaves the evening she died?" Sophie hesitated, her fingers twisting the polishing cloth. "Well, Madame Dubois, from the 4th floor, came by around 7. She brought a bottle of wine, said it was a gift to cheer Madame up. They talked for a bit. Then Madame Dubois left. I poured the wine later from the decanter, as Madame asked." Her voice faltered. Was it something in the wine?" Miss Marple's expression remained serene, though her mind seized on the detail. "You poured from the decanter, not the bottle?" she asked. Sophie nodded, explaining that Eleanor preferred her wine decanted to breathe. This was significant. The poison could have been introduced at any point after the bottle was opened. "And this bottle from Madame Dubois, did you see it?" Miss Marple pressed gently. "It was a Bordeaux, I think," Sophie said. "Wrapped in tissue, very fancy. Madame seemed pleased, but—" She bit her lip. "She was nervous that night, kept looking at the door." Thanking Sophie, Miss Marple made a mental note to examine Madame Dubois more closely. The young widow's gift of wine, presented as neighbourly kindness, could mask a darker intent. Envy, Miss Marple knew, could curdle into malice, especially when wealth like Eleanor's was at stake. She recalled a case in her village where a seemingly generous gift of homemade jam had concealed a lethal dose of arsenic. Human nature, whether in Chipping Cleghorn or Paris, followed familiar patterns. Her inquiries led her next to a small cafe across from the apartment building, a cosy establishment with fogged windows and the aroma of espresso hanging in the air. Eleanor had mentioned frequenting it in her letters, drawn by its proximity and the chance to sketch passers-by. Miss Marple settled at a corner table, her umbrella dripping beside her, and ordered a café au lait. The waiter, a wiry man with a pencil moustache, recognized her as Eleanor's guest after a moment's scrutiny. "A sad loss, madame," he said, wiping the counter. "She came here often, always with her sketchbook." "Did she meet anyone here regularly?" Miss Marple asked, her tone conversational. The waiter glanced around, then leaned in, his voice low. There was a man, foreign, maybe Eastern European, with a scar across his cheek. They met several times, always at that table by the window. He was quiet, paid in cash, spoke in whispers. I didn't like his look, too sharp, like a fox. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face betrayed nothing. A scarred man. Secretive meetings. This echoed the figure in the dark coat Pierre had described. "When was the last time you saw them together?" she asked. "2 days ago," the waiter replied. They argued, not loudly, but tense. She left in a hurry and he stayed, staring out the window like he was waiting for someone. This new thread tightened the web. Eleanor's unease, the notes, the man in the dark coat, and now this scarred stranger, each suggested a conspiracy that had culminated in her death. Miss Marple sipped her coffee, her mind sifting through possibilities. Was the scarred man an agent of Eleanor's cousin Arthur, seeking to intimidate her over the inheritance? Or was he tied to Monsieur Lefebvre, whose interest in Eleanor's paintings hinted at greed? And Madame Dubois? Her wine bottle loomed large, a potential vessel for poison. As she left the café, the rain had eased to a fine mist, and Miss Marple paused to observe the building across the street. Its windows gleamed like watchful eyes, and for a moment she thought she saw a shadow move behind one on the 4th floor. Madame Dubois' apartment, perhaps? She made a mental note to visit her, perhaps under the guise of borrowing sugar. Neighbours, she had learned, often revealed more in casual moments than in formal interviews. Back in Eleanor's apartment, Miss Marple examined the desk in the drawing room, where papers lay in slight disarray. Among them was a receipt from a local jeweller for a locket Eleanor had commissioned. A gift, perhaps, or a clue. She also found a sketch, half-finished, depicting a Parisian street scene with a figure in a dark coat, hat pulled low. The lines were hurried, almost frantic, as if Eleanor had drawn it in a moment of agitation. Miss Marple tucked the sketch into her handbag. It might prove useful later. The day drew to a close with the sky still heavy, the city's lights reflecting in puddles like scattered jewels. Miss Marple sat by the fire. Her knitting resumed, but her thoughts were far from idle. The almond-scented wine, Sophie's account of the decanter, the scarred man at the café, and the missing parcel formed a puzzle with jagged edges. She recalled a village doctor who had once overlooked a poisoning because he trusted appearances. She would not make the same mistake. As she retired to her room, the building creaked under the weight of the storm, and a faint sound, a soft thud, like a door closing stealthily, reached her ears. Miss Marple's hand paused on her doorknob. Someone was awake, moving in the shadows. Paris, with its elegance and intrigue, was proving as treacherous as any rural scandal, and she resolved to tread carefully, her quiet vigilance a match for whatever darkness lay ahead. Chapter 5. The Man in the Dark Coat. The Parisian rain, now a steady drizzle, cloaked the city in a veil of silver, softening the edges of its grand boulevards and lending an air of secrecy to its narrow alleys. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the damp chill, stood at the window of Eleanor Hargreaves's apartment, her gaze fixed on the Seine's restless currents, the events of the past days, the bitter scent of cyanide, Sophie's tale of the gifted wine, the waiter's account of a scarred stranger, had woven a tapestry of suspicion that demanded her attention. Yet it was the figure in the dark coat, mentioned by both Pierre and Eleanor's letter, that tugged most insistently at her thoughts. In her experience, such shadowy figures were rarely innocent bystanders. They were often the linchpins of a deeper plot, their presence a clue to motives hidden beneath polished surfaces. Determined to pursue this thread, Miss Marple donned her sturdy mackintosh and a hat with a modest brim, her umbrella a shield against both rain and prying eyes. She had learned from the waiter that the scarred man frequented a small art gallery owned by Monsieur André Lefebvre, a detail that dovetailed with Eleanor's mention of her paintings. Art, Miss Marple reflected, was a world where beauty masked avarice, and Lefebvre's guarded demeanour suggested he knew more than he let on. She set out for the gallery, a discreet establishment tucked between a patisserie and a bookshop on a quiet street off the Champs-Élysées. The gallery's facade was unassuming, its windows displaying a single canvas, a vibrant still life of roses and wine bottles, its colours almost too vivid against the grey day. Inside, the air was warm, scented with wax polish and the faint musk of old canvas. Monsieur Lefebvre stood behind a mahogany counter, examining a ledger with the intensity of a man guarding secrets. His silver hair gleamed under the chandelier, and his silk cravat seemed an affectation meant to distract from his calculating eyes. "Mademoiselle Marple," he greeted, his voice smooth but wary, an unexpected pleasure. "Are you an art enthusiast, or merely seeking shelter from the rain?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression as guileless as a village spinster's. "A bit of both, perhaps," she replied, her eyes sweeping the room. The walls held an eclectic mix: impressionist landscapes, modernist abstracts, and one painting that stopped her breath. A moody Parisian street scene, its cobblestones slick with rain, dominated by a solitary figure in a dark coat, hat tilted to obscure his face. The brushstrokes were confident yet emotive, and in the corner, a faint signature: E.H. Eleanor Hargreaves. "This is remarkable," Miss Marple said, gesturing to the painting. "One of Eleanor's, I presume." Lefebvre's fingers tightened on his pen, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "Indeed," he said, recovering quickly. "A recent acquisition from a private seller. Madame Hargreaves had talent, though she undervalued it. I offered to exhibit her work, but she was reluctant." His tone suggested irritation, masked by politeness. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Reluctance could provoke resentment, especially if Eleanor's paintings held unexpected value. She recalled a Chipping Cleghorn incident where a farmer's amateur watercolours, discovered to be rare, had sparked a bitter feud. "Did she ever mention selling them elsewhere?" she asked, her voice mild. Lefebvre's eyes narrowed. "No, she was quite private. A pity. She could have made a name." He turned away, busying himself with a stack of frames, but Miss Marple noted the stiffness in his posture. She lingered, examining other paintings, her thoughts circling the possibility that Lefebvre's interest in Eleanor's work was more than aesthetic. As she left the gallery, the drizzle thickened and a figure caught her eye across the street. A man in a dark coat, his hat pulled low, his silhouette mirroring the painting's shadowy figure. Her heart quickened, but she maintained her unhurried pace, her umbrella angled to conceal her scrutiny. He moved with purpose, his steps measured, and Miss Marple, with the stealth of long practice, followed at a distance. The streets of Paris, with their twists and turns, offered ample cover, and she navigated them with the ease of one accustomed to observing without being seen. The man led her to a narrow lane near the Ile de la Cité, where he entered a dilapidated hotel, its sign faded and its windows grimy. Miss Marple hesitated, then slipped into the lobby, where a bored clerk barely glanced up from his newspaper. The air was stale, heavy with cigarette smoke and neglect. From a dimly lit corridor, she overheard a low voice, accented and harsh, speaking in English. "The job's done, but the old woman's friend is asking questions. We need to move the goods soon." Miss Marple's breath caught. The old woman could only be Eleanor, and goods suggested something tangible. Her paintings, perhaps? She edged closer, her umbrella dripping softly, and caught a glimpse of the speaker through a cracked door. A lean man with a scarred cheek, his dark coat slung over a chair. His companion, unseen, murmured agreement, their words too low to discern. She withdrew, her mind alight with possibilities. This man was no mere loiterer, was part of a scheme, and his presence linked Lefebvre's gallery to Eleanor's death. Returning to Rue de la Paix, Miss Marple pondered the scarred man's words. Move the goods implied urgency, perhaps a plan to profit from Eleanor's paintings now that she was gone. She recalled the missing parcel Sophie had mentioned, a small box, possibly containing a forged painting to replace one of Eleanor's originals. Forgery was a lucrative game, and Lefebvre, with his gallery and connections, was well placed to orchestrate it. But why murder? Intimidation might have sufficed to pressure Eleanor into selling. The cyanide suggested a more personal motive. Envy, perhaps, or desperation. Back in the apartment, Miss Marple sought out Pierre, finding him polishing the brass fixtures in the lobby. His cheerful demeanour faltered under her gentle scrutiny. "Pierre," she said, her voice soft as a confidante's, "you mentioned a man in a dark coat arguing with Eleanor. Did he ever visit the gallery across the river?" Pierre's hands stilled, his eyes darting to the courtyard. I may have seen him there once, mademoiselle, leaving late at night, but I cannot be sure. It was dark." His reluctance confirmed her suspicion. Pierre saw more than he admitted, his loyalty perhaps swayed by fear or a bribe. That evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting a pretext for deep thought. The scarred man, Lefebvre's gallery, the missing parcel, and the poisoned wine formed a constellation of clues, each pointing to a scheme rooted in greed. She recalled a village jeweller who had once swapped genuine gems for paste, his crime uncovered by a single careless receipt. Could Eleanor's paintings hold similar value? Their worth a motive for murder? And Madame Dubois, with her timely gift of wine, her role remained unclear, but her envy of Eleanor's wealth was palpable. As the clock struck 10, a soft knock interrupted her reverie. Sophie entered, her face pale. "Mademoiselle, I found this in Madame's desk, hidden in a book." She handed over a folded note, its edges worn. Miss Marple unfolded it to reveal a single line in unfamiliar handwriting. "The truth lies in the rain." Cryptic, yet deliberate, it echoed the anonymous warnings Eleanor had burned. Miss Marple's fingers traced the words, her mind conjuring a Chipping Cleghorn spinster who had hidden a similar note, revealing a blackmailer's identity. The rain continued outside, a relentless witness to Paris's secrets. Miss Marple tucked the note away, her resolve hardening. The man in the dark coat was a key, but not the only one. Tomorrow she would confront Madame Dubois and probe Lefebvre further, her quiet persistence peeling back the layers of deceit. In a city of light, darkness thrived, but Miss Marple was no stranger to shadows, and she would follow this one to its source. Chapter 6. The Truth in the Rain. The Parisian rain had softened to a fine mist by the third evening, draping the city in a gossamer veil that blurred the gaslights into halos. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room of Eleanor Hargreaves's apartment, her knitting needles moving with a deceptive calm, their rhythmic click a counterpoint to the storm of thoughts within. The clues she had gathered, the cyanide-laced wine, the missing parcel, the scarred man in the dark coat, and the painting signed E.H. in Monsieur Lefebvre's gallery, had begun to coalesce into a pattern, though its edges remained tantalizingly elusive. She knew from her chipping Cleghorn days that truth often hid in plain sight, cloaked in the ordinary, and it was time to draw the threads together. Miss Marple had arranged a gathering in Eleanor's apartment, a seemingly innocuous request to discuss fond memories of her friend. She invited Inspector Dubois, whose sceptical brow suggested he humoured her only to expedite his paperwork. Madame Claire Dubois, the young widow with her jasmine perfume and restless eyes, Monsieur André Lefebvre, the art dealer whose polished charm masked a predator's wariness, and Pierre, the concierge, whose cheerful facade had begun to crack under her gentle probing. Sophie, the maid, was tasked with serving tea, her nervous glances betraying her unease. The stage was set, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming presence, was ready to direct the scene. The drawing-room, lit by the soft glow of a chandelier, felt smaller with its occupants assembled. Rain pattered against the tall windows, a persistent reminder of the night Eleanor died. Miss Marple sat near the fire, her knitting in her lap, her spectacles glinting as she surveyed the group. Inspector Dubois stood by the mantel, arms crossed, his impatience barely concealed. Madame Dubois perched on a velvet chaise, her fur-trimmed dress a touch too grand for the occasion. Lefebvre leaned against a bookcase, a cigar unlit between his fingers, his eyes darting to the door. Pierre hovered near the tea tray, his hands fidgeting with a napkin. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began, her voice soft yet carrying the weight of authority. "I wish to honour Eleanor by understanding her final days. But, you see, I cannot help but notice certain inconsistencies." She paused, letting the word hang in the air like the mist outside. Inspector Dubois shifted, but she continued, her tone as mild as if discussing village gossip. Eleanor was troubled before her death. Notes slipped under her door, footsteps in the night, a man in a dark coat watching her. And then, the wine that ended her life, laced with cyanide. A gasp escaped Sophie, who nearly dropped a teacup. Madame Dubois's lips tightened, and Lefebvre's cigar twitched. Inspector Dubois frowned. "Mademoiselle, we found no evidence of poison. The doctor—" "Forgive me, Inspector," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "but doctors can miss what they do not seek. The wine glass beside Eleanor bore an almond-like scent, unmistakable to those familiar with cyanide. I preserved it, should you wish to test it." She gestured to a small box on the table, where the glass lay wrapped in a handkerchief. Dubois' skepticism wavered, and he nodded for an officer to retrieve it. Miss Marple turned to the group, her eyes keen behind her spectacles. "Let us consider Eleanor's life here. She was wealthy, recently widowed, and an amateur painter whose works, I've learned, were gaining value. Such wealth attracts attention, does it not? In my village, I once knew a widow whose inheritance drew vultures. Some subtle, some bold. Eleanor faced both." She fixed her gaze on Lefebvre, who stiffened. "Monsieur Lefebvre, you admired Eleanor's paintings, particularly one in your gallery, a street scene with a figure in a dark coat, signed E.H. You claimed it came from a private cellar, but Eleanor painted it. Why conceal that?" Lefebvre's smile was strained. "A misunderstanding, mademoiselle. She gave it to me to sell, anonymously, to avoid attention." "Yet she refused to sell others," Miss Marple countered. "Her paintings were valuable, especially after her husband's death elevated their provenance. You saw profit, but she resisted. Did you employ someone to persuade her?" She let the question linger, her eyes flicking to Pierre, who paled. "Pierre," she continued, "you saw a man in a dark coat, arguing with Eleanor. You also saw him at Lefebvre's gallery, late at night. Was he acting on Monsieur's orders? Pierre's hands trembled, but he remained silent, his loyalty, or fear, holding firm. Miss Marple turned to Madame Dubois, whose fingers clutched her handbag. "And you, madam, brought Eleanor a bottle of wine the evening she died. A generous gesture, but curious, given your strained relations." Sophie poured from the decanter, not the bottle, yet the poison reached Eleanor's glass. How convenient that the bottle has since disappeared. Madame Dubois' face flushed. "I resent the implication. I brought the wine as a kindness. She was lonely." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but unyielding. "Yet envy is a powerful motive. Eleanor's wealth, her elegance, her independence, did they not grate against your own circumstances? A forged will, naming you a beneficiary, would solve many problems, would it not?" The room tensed, the rain's patter the only sound. Miss Marple wove her theory with quiet precision, drawing on her village wisdom. Eleanor's death was no accident. Monsieur Lefebvre sought her paintings, employing a man, the scarred stranger I overheard at a hotel, speaking of moving the goods. His intimidation failed, so another acted. The missing parcel, likely a forged painting, was meant to muddy the waters, suggesting Eleanor's works were less unique. But when she stood firm, poison became the solution. She paused, her eyes on Madame Dubois. "The wine you brought was decanted, and somewhere in that process, cyanide was added. Not by Sophie, who adored her mistress, nor Pierre, who merely observed. You, madame, had motive and opportunity. The will, I suspect, lies hidden in your apartment, waiting for the right moment." Madame Dubois sprang up, her voice shrill. "This is absurd! You've no proof." Miss Marple remained calm. "The glass will prove the poison, and the scarred man, arrested this morning, has named Monsieur Lefebvre as his employer. He spoke of intimidation, not murder, which points to you, madame. Your envy, your visits, your wine, they fit too neatly." Lefebvre broke in, his voice sharp. "I wanted her paintings, yes, but I didn't kill her. The man was to scare her, nothing more." His admission, blurted in panic, confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions of his role, if not the murder itself. Inspector Dubois, now alert, stepped forward. "If this glass tests positive for cyanide, we'll search Madame Dubois' apartment. Mademoiselle Marple, you've given us much to consider." Madame Dubois' composure cracked, her hands shaking as she sank back onto the chaise. I only wanted what was fair," she whispered, her confession a thread unravelling. Miss Marple watched, her face serene but her heart heavy. Greed and envy, as in Chipping Cleghorn, had woven a deadly net. As the police prepared to act, Miss Marple gathered her knitting, the rain now a faint whisper outside. The truth had emerged, as it always did, from the shadows of human frailty. Paris, with its elegance, was no different from her village. Motives laid bare under scrutiny, like stitches in a familiar pattern. Chapter 7. The trap closes. The rain had dwindled to a faint patter, leaving the Parisian night hushed, as if the city itself held its breath after Miss Jane Marple's revelations. The drawing-room of Eleanor Hargreaves's apartment, once a haven of elegance, now felt like a stage where the final act of a grim drama unfolded. The chandelier's light cast long shadows, flickering over the faces of those gathered. Inspector Dubois, his scepticism replaced by a steely focus. Madame Claire Dubois, her composure fraying like a worn tapestry. Monsieur André Lefebvre, his polished facade crumbling under the weight of his own admissions. and Pierre, the concierge, whose nervous glances betrayed a man caught in a web not entirely of his making. Sophie, the maid, lingered by the door, her hands clasped tightly as if bracing for the storm's aftermath. Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting folded in her lap, her serene demeanour a stark contrast to the tension that crackled in the air. Inspector Dubois, now clutching the box containing the preserved wine-glass, paced before the fireplace, his moustache twitching with newfound purpose. "Mademoiselle Marple," he said, his voice clipped but respectful, "your observations are compelling. If this glass tests positive for cyanide, as you suggest, we are dealing with murder. But motive and opportunity must be proven." His eyes swept the room, settling on Madame Dubois, whose pallor had deepened, her jasmine perfume no longer masking the scent of fear. Miss Marple inclined her head, her spectacles glinting. "Indeed, Inspector. Motive is often the key, and in my experience, it hides in the simplest places. Envy in a neighbour's smile, greed in a handshake. Let us consider the facts." She spoke with the gentle authority of one accustomed to unravelling village intrigues, her words drawing all eyes. Eleanor Hargreaves was a wealthy widow, her inheritance a beacon to those in want. Her paintings, modest though she thought them, held value, enough to tempt Monsieur Lefebvre, whose gallery profited from obscure artists. Lefebvre shifted, his cigar now a forgotten prop. "I've admitted my interest," he said sharply. "I hired a man to persuade her. Yes, but not to kill. I deal in art, not death." His protest carried a note of desperation, and Miss Marple noted the sweat beading on his brow. A telltale sign of guilt, if not for murder, then for complicity. "Persuasion," she mused, her voice soft but piercing, "can take many forms." The man in the dark coat, your associate with the scarred cheek, was seen arguing with Eleanor, loitering near her building and speaking of moving goods at a hotel. He intimidated her as you intended, but when she resisted, another hand acted. She turned to Madame Dubois, whose fingers now gripped her handbag like a lifeline. "Madam, your gift of wine was no mere kindness. Eleanor died after drinking from a decanter filled from your bottle. How curious that it vanished afterward." Madame Dubois rose, her voice trembling with indignation. "This is slander. I brought the wine to mend fences. She was aloof, always flaunting her wealth. I meant no harm." Her eyes darted to the door, as if calculating escape, but Inspector Dubois' officer blocked the way, his presence a silent warning. Miss Marple continued, unruffled. "In Chipping Cleghorn, I once knew a woman who poisoned a rival's tea, claiming it was a gesture of goodwill. The heart can deceive, madame, especially when envy festers. You envied Eleanor's fortune, her grace, her independence. A forged will, perhaps, promised you a share of her estate, a temptation too great to resist." A stifled sob came from Sophie, who whispered, "Madame was so kind. She didn't deserve this." Pierre, standing near the tea-tray, looked as if he might bolt. His loyalty to the building's residents strained by the mounting evidence. Miss Marple's gaze softened as she addressed him. "Pierre, you saw much but said little. The parcel delivered to Eleanor that day, small, unmarked, where did it go? Did someone take it to obscure the trail?" Pierre's face crumpled, his hands wringing the napkin. I saw Madame Dubois take it from the hall table after Madame Hargreaves died. She said it was hers, delivered by mistake. I thought nothing of it." His confession, blurted under pressure, sent a ripple through the room. Madame Dubois gasped, her denial cut off by Inspector Dubois' raised hand. "Enough," the inspector said, his tone now commanding. "Madame Dubois, we will search your apartment immediately. If this will exist or the parcel, we'll find it." He nodded to his officer, who stepped forward, ready to escort her. But Miss Marple held up a hand, her voice calm yet insistent. "One moment, Inspector. There is more. The note Sophie found, 'The truth lies in the rain,' was no idle threat. It was a warning, perhaps from someone who knew the plan but lacked the courage to act. Pierre, you heard footsteps outside Eleanor's door at night. Did you ever see who left those notes?" Pierre swallowed hard, his eyes flicking to Lefebvre. "Once, I saw the man with the scar slip something under the door. I thought it was a bill, nothing more." His voice broke, and Miss Marple nodded, piecing the final threads together. "The scarred man, employed by Monsieur Lefebvre, sowed fear to pressure Eleanor into selling her paintings," she said. "But fear alone wasn't enough. Madame Dubois, you saw an opportunity. The parcel, likely a forged painting to diminish Eleanor's originals, was a distraction, but the wine was your weapon. You knew her habits, her trust in Sophie to decant the wine. A small dose of cyanide slipped into the decanter ensured your plan's success." Madame Dubois' face contorted, her defiance crumbling. "I didn't mean to kill her," she cried, her voice raw. "I only wanted her to leave Paris. Her wealth mocked me every day. The wine, it was only to make her ill, to scare her away. I didn't know the dose was too strong." Her confession, torn from her like a confession in a village church, hung heavy in the room. Inspector Dubois stepped forward, his handcuffs glinting. "Madam, you will come with us. The laboratory will confirm the poison, and your apartment may yield the will or the parcel." As the officer led her away, her sobs echoed down the corridor, a stark contrast to the rain's quiet rhythm. Lefebvre, pale but defiant, faced Miss Marple. "I swear I knew nothing of murder. My man was to frighten her, nothing more." Miss Marple's eyes met his, unflinching. "Greed, monsieur, is a slippery slope. Your actions set this tragedy in motion, even if your hand didn't pour the poison." Lefebvre looked away, his cigar falling to the floor, a symbol of his broken ambitions. As the police dispersed, taking Pierre for further questioning, Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her heart heavy but resolute. The rain had nearly stopped, leaving the windows streaked with tears. Paris, with its glittering facade, had revealed its darker heart, much like the scandals of Chipping Cleghorn. She thought of Eleanor, her friend lost to greed and envy, and felt a pang of sorrow. Yet the truth had emerged, as it always did under her quiet scrutiny, like a pattern knitted from scattered threads. Sophie, lingering by the door, whispered, "Thank you, mademoiselle. Madame can rest now." Miss Marple smiled gently, her work here nearly done, but her mind already turning to the journey home, and the next puzzle life might present. Chapter 8. Return to Chipping Cleghorn. The train from Dover to London rattled through the English countryside, its rhythm a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil Miss Jane Marple had left behind in Paris. She sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly, her gaze lost in the patchwork of fields and hedgerows, bathed in the soft light of an autumn afternoon. The rain that had cloaked her investigation in Paris was absent here, replaced by a crisp breeze that carried the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Chipping Cleghorn awaited, its quiet lanes and familiar faces a balm after the glittering deceit of the French capital. Yet, as the train hummed along, Miss Marple's mind lingered on Eleanor Hargreaves, her friend lost to a web of greed and envy, and the delicate unravelling of a mystery that had tested her keenest instincts. Back in her cosy parlour, with its chintz curtains and rosewood tea table, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, a steaming cup of Darjeeling before her. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow over the room, and she welcomed the arrival of her friend, Miss Letitia Bunner, whose cheerful chatter was as predictable as the village clock. Letitia, with her unruly grey curls and penchant for gossip, bustled in, her eyes alight with curiosity. "Jane, you must tell me everything," she exclaimed, settling onto the sofa with a rustle of tweed. "Paris! A murder! I've heard whispers, but I want the truth, every thrilling detail." Miss Marple smiled, her expression as mild as ever, though her blue eyes twinkled with the satisfaction of a puzzle solved. "It was a sad affair, Letitia," she began, her voice soft but compelling, "but not so different from the scandals we've seen here. Human nature, you see, wears the same guise, whether in a grand Parisian apartment or a Chipping Cleghorn cottage." She sipped her tea, letting the warmth ground her as she recounted the tale, her words painting a picture as vivid as Eleanor's lost canvases. "Eleanor Hargreaves was a woman of grace and wealth," she said, "but her fortune drew shadows. Anonymous notes, footsteps in the night, a man in a dark coat, signs of a plot that ended in poison." Letitia gasped, her hands clasped, but Miss Marple continued, her tone measured. "The police thought it heart failure, but I noticed the wineglass. It sent sharp with cyanide. In Chipping Cleghorn, I once knew a gardener who tampered with a rival's cider. The signs were much the same." She described the residence of Rix de la Paix. Pierre, the concierge, whose watchful eyes missed little yet, spoke less. Monsieur Lefebvre, the art dealer whose greed for Eleanor's paintings led him to hire a thug. And Madame Claire Dubois, whose envy had festered into murder. Madame Dubois brought the fatal wine, Miss Marple explained, claiming it a neighbourly gift. But her heart was heavy with resentment. Eleanor's wealth, her elegance, were a mirror to her own discontent. A forged will, hidden in her apartment, would have secured her a share of the estate had she not misjudged the poison's strength. Letitia leaned forward, enthralled. And the man in the dark coat? Was he the killer? "No," Miss Marple replied, her needles pausing. "He was Lefebvre's tool, sent to intimidate Eleanor into selling her paintings, which had grown valuable after her husband's death. The scarred man I overheard in a shabby hotel spoke of moving goods, confirming the scheme. But it was Madame Dubois who acted, slipping cyanide into the decanter when Sophie wasn't looking. Her confession, wrung out in that final confrontation, was as much a release as a defeat." She recounted the scene in Eleanor's drawing room, where her quiet deductions had unravelled the plot. The preserved wineglass, the note reading, "The truth lies in the rain," the missing parcel, all had pointed to a conspiracy rooted in avarice. Lefebvre admitted his part, she said, but denied murder. And the scarred man, arrested by Inspector Dubois, corroborated his story. The police found the forged will in Madame Dubois' apartment, tucked inside a hollowed-out novel, a trick I've seen before, Letitia, in a vicar's study no less. Letitia clapped her hands, her excitement undimmed by the tragedy. "Oh, Jane, you're a marvel! To think all this in Paris, under the noses of those French police!" Miss Marple's smile was wry. Inspector Dubois was thorough, in his way, but he lacked imagination. People reveal themselves, Letitia, if you watch closely. A nervous glance, a trembling hand, these speak louder than words. Madame Dubois' envy was plain in her tightened lips, Lefebvre's greed in his evasive eyes. Even Pierre, the concierge, betrayed his knowledge with a flicker of fear. She leaned back, her thoughts drifting to the painting that had sparked so much trouble. A Parisian street scene, now safely housed in a museum. Its signature E.H., a quiet tribute to Eleanor's talent. Her paintings were her legacy, Miss Marple said softly, and they drew predators, just as a widow's fortune once did in our village. The rain in Paris hid much, but it also washed away pretense, revealing the truth. Letitia sighed, her romantic soul touched. Poor Eleanor, to die so far from home, in that beautiful city. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, her voice tinged with sorrow. But she is at peace now, and her story is told. The museum will honor her work, and perhaps that is justice of a kind. She picked up her knitting, the needles resuming their gentle rhythm, a signal that the tale was done. Yet, as Letitia prattled on about village news, a squabble over the church fete, a missing cat, Miss Marple's mind wandered. Paris had been a reminder of how universal human frailties were. Greed, envy, fear, they wove the same patterns, whether in a grand city or a quiet hamlet. She thought of a Chipping Cleghorn grocer who had once swindled a widow, his crime uncovered by a misplaced receipt. The parallels to Lefebvre's scheme were uncanny, and Madame Dubois' desperate act echoed a seamstress who had poisoned a rival's tea, her guilt betrayed by a trembling needle. The fire popped, and Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. There was a comfort in these patterns, a predictability that made mysteries solvable. She had faced Paris's shadows and emerged with the truth, just as she had in countless village intrigues. The world might change, but people did not, and her quiet vigilance was a match for any deceit. As Letitia rose to leave, promising to spread the tale, with embellishments no doubt, Miss Marple glanced at the window, where the last light of day painted the roses and gold. A letter lay on the table, newly arrived, its postmark unfamiliar, perhaps another puzzle beckoning. She smiled faintly, her fingers tracing the wool in her lap. Life, like her knitting, was a series of stitches, each one leading to the next, and she was ready for whatever pattern might emerge.